And good afternoon, Charles Moscowitz here. Thanks for joining me, everyone. Welcome to the program. My guest is James R. Keema. He is an author, educator, champion of freedom. He's published 3 books and numerous critically acclaimed articles. And the book that came to my attention today is 2084. James, thanks for joining me this afternoon.
Thank you, Charles. It's a pleasure for me.
James, let's, as you mentioned earlier, your book is quite prescient in these times of great tumult and confusion when we really are seeing things occur that would have been completely unthinkable even 2 or 3 months ago. Let's go right to discussing the basic premise of your book, if you don't mind.
Sure. It operates on several levels. The most obvious level is that it's a mystery thriller. There's a family of 4, and the 2 children in that family are kidnapped. And much of the plot revolves around the family going on a cross-country journey to try to find out who kidnapped them, why, and hopefully to eventually save the 2 children. But as they go across the country on this epic journey, this is in the year 2084 in an America that's in civil war. It's at war with itself. And there's various factions that they have to encounter and deal with and fight their way through in order to get to their ultimate objective. But what makes the book even more compelling is that when you've got an environment like that where there's so much trauma, so much tragedy, so much war, so much violence going on, the characters in the book are really forced to evaluate, what is the meaning of life? What is this all about? What really is society all about? And it's the perfect venue to really introduce some powerful topics and ideas. And that's probably the most important part of the book, is that the story is a parable for some rather deep ideas.
And we're in the middle of a situation that may take a long time to weed out and evaluate, but we seem to be having things happen that look like they're random, but yet there's a certain plan to it all. And I don't want to put on a tin hat here, but the response, for example, to the pandemic, even in late March, I heard leaders of governors and the president and the speaker say that, the best approach to dealing with this disease was to make sure you wash your hands and keep hygiene, and if you're sick, stay home. And then I recall a reporter suggesting to the governor of Illinois, who's a big liberal governor, and do you think it's possible that the city of Chicago and that the state of Illinois might undergo a shutdown by law, a lockdown? And he said, "Oh, of course not. That's unthinkable." And yet, within the week, that's exactly what happened. And we have seen an occurrence that is unlike anything in history. It's almost like, I don't know if history will tell us this is an overreaction, but for practical purposes, we're in a state of medical martial law. We can't go outside unless we cover our face. In some states, it's even more strong. And then, of course, we then have this terrible racist incident in Minneapolis that's resulted in what appears to me to be a national, even possibly an international communist revolution hitting major cities where people are coming in and looting and burning black businesses and black neighborhoods.
Well, it is an interesting series of developments, and I share all your frustration and concerns about them. But I think it's bigger and deeper than you might even think, because this conflict really goes back more than 1,000 years. When you go back to the history of Western civilization, the birthplace of it in Greece, you had the Athens versus Sparta conflict. And we've had this conflict between individualism and collectivism forever. And it's worked its way through Western civilization. And we reached a point in Europe, around the 18th century, where we had the Enlightenment, and there was some hope that we were going to break out of it, with the French Revolution, the American Revolution. But that conflict has never gone away. When you think about America, we still have that conflict running through our society. We have the individualists and we have the collectivists. And that war's been going on forever. And we're just seeing manifestations of it now in a different form, the things that you mentioned, whether it's the civil unrest that we're experiencing right now, or whether it was the response to the COVID-19. Those are all examples of a heavy-handed administrative state playing with us and treating the rest of us as pawns. It's really an indication of what's always been going on throughout history, that the elites are going to find a way to maintain their power and exercise their power, and the pawns are going to have to deal with it. And I think a lot of us are feeling like pawns right now.
And yet, maybe I sound idealistic here, maybe I even sound simplistic, but I thought that America was different. You know, we are more than any other society in history. We were founded on the principle of that rights come from the Creator, not from the state. It says so it was stated clearly in the Declaration of Independence, and that the state is an entity that is to protect rights, not create rights. That it is there, and that's why we divided it up into various branches that would compete with each other, because the founding fathers, in their geniusness, understood the darker side of human nature, this idea of getting undeserved power and greed. And so they made sure that each side checked the other on a lot of different levels, which I think is a good reflection of human life. I mean, the way we have to restrain our desires and our greed and our, our sense of power by various realities that keep us in check. And I think that certainly the founding generation, and even to this day, most Americans understand this, I believe. And yet it's astonishing to me how willingly people have just rolled over out of fear. I'm not suggesting here that there isn't a disease. It's a terrible disease, but the way it was handled doesn't seem to be consistent with the actual reality of the disease. It seems like there was this massive government reaction based on fear. And now we're being told that we're racist and that, we're going to have this. I mean, we're never going to hear the end of it, that America, that a black man in America is treated the same way as a Jew was treated in Nazi Germany. I mean, it's crazy. And yet that's what we're being told, and that's what we're going to be hearing now. And so many people roll over and accept this.
Yeah, let me back up for just a second. I want to agree with you passionately that I think America was and is very unique, and our founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution, were the greatest political documents in the history of the world. And I think our founding fathers had a genius that was beyond all comprehension. I continue to be in awe of what they created. However, when you flash forward to today, we've got a couple of generations now that don't feel that way, that they've been conditioned by our culture and conditioned by our education system to see our founding documents and the founding fathers as oppressors, as white patriarchs. The documents themselves are just 2 centuries old and outmoded and don't reflect our progressive society of today. So while we are unique as a country, and I'm passionate about our uniqueness, I think there's whole generations of people who don't understand what that uniqueness is. And so they're being influenced by a much different cultural stream right now. And that cultural stream ultimately came from Europe. I mentioned earlier, I talked about that period of enlightenment in the 18th century. America went in one direction with that enlightenment. We followed sort of the Scottish version of that enlightenment, where individuals were sovereign, that while we may not be perfect, we should be free to choose our own paths in lives, and that ultimately good will come from that. Adam Smith was of the same mindset, and that's where he had the invisible hand of the marketplace, that even as individuals imperfectly go about their way, good things will happen and wonderful things will happen. And that's what happened in the U.S. But coming out of that enlightenment, you had the French Revolution, which was a much different view. And in the French Revolution, you saw a vision of society where government's was to perfect humanity, that it was to become an administrative state, that there was a certain group of elitists who were going to tell us how to live, what to do, how to think. And ultimately that became socialism and communism in Europe. But we've imported a lot of that. Starting in the early part of the 20th century, more and more of that came to the U.S. And it's grown and grown in our culture to the point now where I'd say that's almost our predominant culture now, that the collective takes precedence over the individual. And so what you're talking about today is the things that you can't understand, like how did we just roll over with this pandemic? And I'm as astonished as you are by that our entire society accepted the fact that we were going to put 40 million people out of work, that we were going to bankrupt all of these businesses, that we were going to lock ourselves in our home. And we basically said nothing as a society in response to that. But that's part of that cultural shift that's occurred. And that's what led me to write this book, is that this isn't America, the America we used to know.
It's very troubling. I mean, it's overreach, to put it mildly, and we could have taken a different approach and probably have had the same result. And the sad thing is that in an American society traditionally, and I would even argue in a moral society, and in fact, indeed, the very definition of morality is that the individual and that the nation and that the community protects the more vulnerable member of that community. That's what makes us different than the animal kingdom. And yet, in this particular pandemic, we've seen a complete inversion of that by having states, like, for example, New York State and several others, actually put together a mandate that would put a person infected with this virus into nursing homes. And the result is that thousands of people were exposed and died. A large percentage of the people who died of this terrible virus were in nursing homes and were exposed because they were not protected by these particular states. And while that was occurring, the rest of us who are more healthy and who are younger and who don't have existing conditions and who very well may catch the virus, and as most people who do, might be sick for a couple of weeks and they stay in like you would with chickenpox, they're told they have to be locked down and they have to literally lose their freedom. And the weird thing about it is that they just go ahead and march forward and do it and criticize anyone who questions it.
Yeah, it is astonishing. As you mentioned, with this virus, the healthy people are not, or the young people are not all that affected by it. And yet we decided to quarantine even those who are probably not very much at risk, or even less risk than the flu. And what's even more frightening, as you and I mentioned a couple of times here, is we accepted it so easily. And when I think about that, think about the next crisis that comes. And maybe we have a different leadership in this country, and someone says we've now reached the point where climate is a crisis that requires mass action and authoritarian activity on the part of our administrative state. Think what's going to happen to us then when they decide, because of the climate crisis, we have to do this, we have to do that, we have to sacrifice our liberties, we have to give up our wealth. It's almost such an enormous prospect of totalitarianism that you think that can't possibly happen. But when you look at what happened in this pandemic, where we just gave away our freedoms and didn't even squeal a bit, I actually can see it happening now.
I think that that's exactly what's coming down the pike. I think that they couldn't pull that one off because the weather. First, they made reference to global warming, and then when that didn't work, they made reference to climate change, and it didn't really resonate. Most people didn't either believe it or they felt that it was something that was far off, including a lot of scientists, and so they needed to have something that was more urgent, that was a threat. It's kind of like. I suppose during the Cold War, in the early days, we felt that the Ruskies were going to drop the nuclear bomb any minute. So they built fallout shelters and they built everybody duck and cover. There was this fear that ran through society. I remember, my late grandmother, may she rest in peace, she used to keep a drawer filled with cans of tuna fish and peanut butter, right? She says, when the Russians come, I want to be prepared. These are terrible scare tactics. And I think that they finally maybe fell upon one with the virus. Now, again, I'm not suggesting that the virus isn't real, although I do find it very suspicious that the World Health Organization, which is part of the UN and which is something that we're supposed to look to as world leaders, that they sat on the reality of this virus for several weeks while people were infecting the world, and that even in January they told the United States that it didn't spread through people. I find that to be very, very strange and very suspicious.
Yeah, this fear element is an important consideration in all of this, because what the administrative state and what the elitists fear the most is independent, free-thinking people who feel like they can control their own lives and make their own decisions. So it's important for their agenda for us to be afraid and to want to sacrifice that liberty and those freedoms to the administrative states so that they can protect us from these demons that are assaulting our society. And so we're going to see that fear in many, many different forms. We're seeing it in many different ways right now. It even goes back to what Franklin Roosevelt did during the Great Depression when he talked about his view of freedom, which was freedom from fear, freedom from want, freedom from hunger, sort of the administrative state elitist perspective on things. We're here to save you. We're here to protect you. Just give up your freedom. Just give up your wealth, and we'll make everything all better. That's what we're seeing play out here.
I think that the election of Donald Trump was not supposed to happen. I think he's a classic counter-revolutionary, if you will. It is a cry for freeing us from this amorphous, double-talking establishment that we allow to use deception and deceptive language as they fritter away our freedoms, and attempt at greater control over more aspects of our lives. And that's why they are at such war against Trump. And it is a war that is fiercer than I think anybody even could possibly imagine, with attempts to literally remove him from office and discredit him. I mean, if you watch the mainstream media, the news every night, the stories about him are so negative, and yet people don't know a lot of the incredible things he's doing. Instead, we see 6 o'clock news, prime time, doing a whole segment on whether he ordered an extra scoop of ice cream at an event, and this is somehow was to view this as horrible. It's I've never seen anything more concerted and more out in the open in terms of trying to discredit and depose him. And I wonder if this whole rotten conspiracy involving thugs coming in from outside and burning and looting black neighborhoods isn't a part of that. And when I say this, I would point out that the governor of Minnesota, the mayor of Minneapolis, these are liberal figures. They have all said that of the 65 people that were arrested for burning and looting businesses, all of them were from out of state, some from out of the United States, some from out of the country. So are we going to find out what's going on here? Who is behind this? Who these people were? Were they part of any group? I doubt it. I think it's all like some kind of a setup to destroy Trump. I know that sounds simplistic, but
Well,
Eric Trump said it in a tweet, and I think he was right. All of this stuff is going to stop the day after the election if Trump loses.
yeah, there's an interesting irony here that when Trump was campaigning on the Republican primary in 2016, I think the mainstream media actually abetted his campaign for a while because they saw it as an opportunity to disrupt the Republican Party, to make them look like buffoons, and to seed all this turmoil. And Trump was the perfect foil for that. I mean, he was willing to say anything. He was very bold, very outspoken. And I think they were actually enjoying the turmoil and sort of egging him on and abetting it a little bit. And to their horror, he actually won the primary and became the presumptive nominee. And then their attitude switched almost immediately. And it became attack after attack to the point where even at the point when he was elected, right after election day, they were talking about trying to instigate faithless electors to change their votes. They were trying to get rid of the electoral college. And then came the Ukraine fiasco, and then the Russian collusion, and then the impeachment. And now we've got the overreaction to the COVID crisis. And now, in my opinion, we've got this overreaction to the event that happened in Minnesota. It's been a long series of things that I think, to your point, are probably somewhat orchestrated.
I think it started the very day he took office. I mean, I remember people agitating, they referred to it as the quote resistance, which is an old communist term, and that they were agitating against senators who confirmed cabinet appointments. I mean, what do they expect? I mean, it was everything to hobble his ability to function. And to my way of thinking, when they point fingers of conspiracy and say that I'm trucking in conspiracy, the biggest conspiracy theory in my lifetime, and one that was completely financed by the government and that involved high-level people, was this cockamamie idea that Donald Trump is a Russian spy. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, they call it a conspiracy theory when you talk about things like that. But when you've got the evidence and the history on your side, that litany I just reeled off about all of the things the left has tried to do to take down the Trump presidency, that's not a conspiracy. They actually tried to do that. All of those events actually happened. You didn't even mention the Kavanaugh hearings where he was trying to do his constitutional duty to appoint a judge, and the entire cultural left descended on Mr. Kavanaugh, tried to destroy his reputation and his career. And, out of it came the Me Too movement, which died a sudden death when Biden became focused on that.
Oh, that's right. I mean, here we are in my own state of Massachusetts. Elizabeth Warren announces that she believes Biden. Really? It's the hypocrisy, right? I mean, it's absurd. And yet they know they can get away with it because they know who they have working with them in the media. For the first time, I think in the history of modern media, mainstream media, they've become so yellow that they will run with a story based upon one anonymous source, something that would have been unthinkable even for Dan Rather. And then of course when it's challenged, they then back away and forget about it, knowing that they've thrown the mud, they've thrown the ball, and that now they can go back to the next one for the next day. It is really, really Orwellian in nature. It's very troubling. It's like what isn't. It's almost like looking at the opposites.
It's not only Orwellian in the sense of the media, because I agree with your comments there, but it's much bigger than just the media. As I mentioned earlier in our discussion, we've got a couple of generations of younger people now who have been conditioned by the education system to actually think the world is the way that the media portrays it. When you think about our cultural icons, our Hollywood movie stars, our musicians, they all, they have very big megaphones and they say the exact same things. They echo the exact same things. And when you think about big tech, the Googles, the Facebooks, the Twitters of the world, they've lined up with that too. And they control the biggest megaphones of all. I mean, they control a huge part of our social discussion now. So when you look at all of that lined up, the media, the big tech companies, the education, how our children are being cultured, and the cultural icons of our society, they're all on that side. And that when you put that megaphone together, it's an enormous megaphone. It's enormous. And it has the capability to drown out reason and rationality.
And, I worry that they're finally going to, after day of drumbeats, they may finally be successful. In my gut, I feel like they're not going to be. I think that Donald Trump is going to be elected with a larger popularity than he had last time, and that the Republicans very well may take back Congress, and the Democrats are going to be set back for a generation. And they're going to have to purge their members of all these left-wing crazies in order to come back. It's going to be like George McGovern in 1972. I hope. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, we've got 5 or 6 months to go yet. It could go either way, in my opinion. And the reason I say that, part of me thinks what you just said, that when you look at flyover country in America, I think they can see through a lot of the BS that's going on right now. And I'd like to have some faith that they're going to make some good decisions here. But what I also see, the left is desperate right now, and we're seeing acts of desperation everywhere. In my opinion, the overreaction to the COVID situation is an act of desperation to take down Trump, in the sense that his biggest calling card, his biggest success, was a roaring economy. I mean, we have the greatest economy in the history of America. And it was helping people that were traditional parts of the Democratic mainstream. Union members were getting paid more. They had better jobs. Yeah. Minorities had higher unemployment or higher employment rates. Their wages were going up. I mean, Trump was positively impacting big parts of the Democratic constituency. And so I think they're going to look for ways to continue to ruin that one signature achievement of Donald Trump. And they've had a bit of a success with this COVID overreaction. But my fear is in the next 5 months, what's next?
Now, James, what you're suggesting is so venal and so diabolical and so evil that it's unbelievable if you think about it, right? That you're saying that they would destroy the economy. They would destroy the businesses of people who have worked all their life to build them. They would destroy the savings of people who are collecting a pension or who are living in retirement, all just to defeat Donald Trump. They would give a handicap to our entire economy just to do that. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying something maybe a little bit deeper, that we've really lined up very tribally in this country right now. That it's very difficult. You know, if you look on social media, there's one tribe on one side, another tribe on the other side. If you look at Congress, there's one tribe on one side, one tribe on another side. We've lost the ability to talk to each other effectively, and we are at a state almost of war right now with each other. That the acrimony has become so bitter. With the speaker tearing up Trump's speech during the State of the Union address and things like that.
Oh my God, that's a crime.
We've become so separated, and I think we've lost our ability to talk.
All we need to do though is shave off a couple of points to win, and put them into the dustbins of history. And I just I hope that with some patience and some careful outreach, we can do that. Anyways, James, listen, let my listeners and viewers know where they can get your excellent book, and maybe talk a little bit more about it.
Okay, well, again, the book is 2084 American Apocalypse. It can be found on Amazon.com. It's in Kindle and paperback format. And I think viewers or readers would find it to be the most thought-provoking book that they've ever read. What drove me to write it was a concern that you look at humanity, and we all are human beings. We all are looking at the same object, calling a human being, and yet we've ended up with ideologies that are so widely diverse and so violently opposed to each other that you got to wonder, how did that happen? So part of what I do, using the parable of this kidnapping and the parable of the Civil War in this book, is I unravel those questions. How did we end up like that? I get down to a very philosophical and moral layer. And I think readers would find that very interesting.
Well, you bring a lot of wisdom to it, and I can see that you've spent a lot of years doing some very good, deep thinking, and I congratulate you for writing it. I hope that you're able to do more of what you're doing right now, which is reaching out to people and getting your message out. So, James Keema, I want to thank you very much for joining me this afternoon.
Thank you, Charles. It was great.
All right. Have a good one.
Take care. Bye now.